Hey, gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I have a very special guest on the pod this week. I have Lottie Hazell. She is an independent publishing consultant, like in the book industry. She's a literary scholar, and most recently, she is a game designer. How you doing, Lottie?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's an absolute delight to have you on. As you know, I'm both a board game and book fanatic, so it's fantastic to have you here. So you work currently in publishing and in book marketing.
Yeah,
Can you tell us a bit about that and how you got there?
sure. Yeah, so um, at the moment in my publishing role, my book publishing role, I am a independent consultant to the trade publishing industry in the UK, and that basically means non-academic books, so books that you'd find in the UK in Waterstones, Barnes and Nobles if you're in the US. Um, and I got to this point in my career by previously working with Penguin Random House Books, so I think um, your listeners, if they're book fans, will probably be familiar with. And working in various marketing departments there before going freelance and independent. And I took the leap to go freelance when I started researching my PhD, which I began in 2019. The years now mean nothing to me because 2020 was such a blur, but yeah.
And so, what made you decide to pursue a PhD while also already employed in the publishing industry?
Before I started working with Penguin, I completed a master's in creative writing, which I adored, and at that point was talking about doing a PhD and staying on. But it was more an interest in doing research rather than having the topic of what I wanted to do. And equally, I wanted to work in the world of selling stories, and marketing is a great position to be in to do that. And you work with all sorts of different types of books, types of audiences, really work out why people want to read things and how you can present books so they flag themselves to a reader as this is something that you might like, which I loved. Um, and then so I had a few years working in-house in publishing, and the idea for my PhD was growing. So it looks at subversion in contemporary literary fiction, mostly written by women. And the catalyst for my research proposal was the Me Too movement in 2017. So I was interested in how Me Too became a marketing buzzword, which is depressing, but is kind of the beast of the nature of the beast in terms of the industry. And I grew my thesis proposal to look at how social movements like Me Too, the method that I've developed could also be applied to something like Black Lives Matter or even the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of how it's covered in the media and in publishing. And so I developed the thesis proposal to look at how Me Too was having an impact on publishing, and if that was an impact on marketing or an impact on storytelling and the books that were actually being published. And so from there, I went freelance and started my thesis research. And yeah, that was 2 years ago now.
That is amazing. And I also think it's really interesting. So you work on subversion in literature, specifically with respect to food.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to even think of, okay, food in literature. I feel like it's one of those things that people kind of see as a set piece, but maybe don't think too much about.
Yeah.
What kind of surprising discoveries have you made by paying more attention to food descriptions and what you read?
Mm. I think it's an interesting one because I think when I say food in literature initially, I think a lot of people understandably think about maybe food writing, specifically food writing and travel writing. And I'm interested in the small, quiet moments of human behaviour where food is instrumental in illustrating something that the author wants us to know about a character's mental state or a relationship that they might have. So in the books that I'm looking at, all of them are published from 2019 onwards, so written supposedly, or they have the chance to be written in the wake of the Me Too movement. And I wouldn't say it's surprising because I think you can see a trend. And it's important to say that trends, when I talk about them, I don't think of them in a linear fashion, because if you think about something like Margaret Atwood's The Edible Woman, which I think was written in the 60s, like that's having progress is not, it doesn't always take a chronological form. But some of the surprising stuff that I came across is how food can be used to not only signify traumas, but process them and be used as a tool to regain control. And that was an interesting recurring theme in the books that I was looking at. Food wasn't always central, but when it was used, it had an element of bodily autonomy or desire or reclaiming space. And I think that's one of the themes that has reoccurred, is that desire to reclaim things that aren't necessarily attributed to women socially or historically. So, eating a lot, eating in public, eating with abandon, an interest in food. There's a really great line in one of the books that I'm looking at, which is Supper Club by Lara Williams. And the line something like that she knew that her interest in food couldn't be publicly visible, talking about body image at that point. And the thing that intrigues me is the reclaiming of those spaces and using them for subverting social kind of expectations or for making new spaces. I think I've just wandered off into a tangent there. So do you feel
nothing wrong with that? No, that's awesome. Honestly, we could probably just do an entire podcast about that.
Yeah.
Come on my booktube channel later. But you're just a relentlessly creative person, clearly, because in addition to all of the work that you're doing with books, you've also become a board game designer. So what spurred that? Have you just been a hobby gamer for a long time? Is it a recent discovery? And what made you want to design?
Yeah. So what made me want to design might be the easiest way into that question, because it kind of links up with my other interests. And so I've been a hobby gamer for like maybe 8 or 9 years now. So my husband and I have always enjoyed playing games together. But more recently, I've become interested in the accessibility of games and what my favourite games are, and the games that I enjoy playing, or games that I can persuade my family and friends who wouldn't describe themselves as hobby gamers to play with me, and that they'd enjoy to play. And so my interest in getting into design was to make games that I think lots of people would be interested in playing. And so the first game that I've designed for our indie publisher, Birdwood Games, is a game called Dog Park, and it's about collecting and walking dogs, which I'm obsessed with. I have a Springer Spaniel called Rupert, who's my muse, apparently. And I designed Dog Park to be a game that would be easy to play, beautiful to look at, and is something that you could approach as someone who doesn't describe themselves as a gamer. The reason that this links to my work in marketing is I was always interested in reaching out to people that maybe don't describe themselves as readers or don't walk into a bookshop, or how to reach those people when that might not be the easiest, if it's not via a bookshop, or if they're not on an email list that's owned by a publisher. How do you find people to give them books that they want to play? And that's part of the reason why we created the publisher, and why we're publishing Dog Park, is to reach people who I think will love board games. Board games are amazing, and they deliver such joyful experiences, and I'd like to share those with more people.
So you are someone who is highly conscious of narrative and of storytelling in the most traditional way for us right now, right? Which is books. I guess maybe the most traditional way would be oral storytelling, but we're in a text culture. So what connections are you finding between the story work that you do, both as a scholar and a marketer, and the story you're creating through your game?
I think the commonalities that I find mostly come in the community, in the shared experience, even though with reading often that's an individual experience. Much of the aftermath is shared, whether you talk about it with friends or whether you make a booktube video about it and encourage discussion. And the same, I think, is true in gaming, but in a more immediate way. Often, unless you're playing solo games, you have a community experience with storytelling, and you get to evolve a narrative together whilst you're playing a game. And I love the potential of that. And I think on a related note, there is a really interesting consideration for storytellers to think about the multiple formats in which they can tell stories. Like the age that we're living in now, with easily accessible podcasts or more easily accessible audio, with great quality television, with film, all sorts of different emerging digital formats. Board games are another way to tell stories. Firstly, in the game designer to set the story up for you, but to create an opportunity to play and to develop that scenario yourself as the player.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that you should say that, because I think one thing I always wonder about with board games, right, is how do you find the right balance between narrative and creating a compelling one, and then also allowing agency for the players? Because, when I pick up a novel, I mean, there's interaction in the sense that I'm thinking about what I'm reading, but the person who wrote is the one who's driving, and I'm responding to what they did. And then, gaming is obviously a little less controlled. So, has that given you kind of cross insights across your industries? And how does it change your approach to, both the things you're writing, because I know that you're writing for your dissertation, and what you're designing?
That's a really interesting question. When you were talking about the differences between novels and board games in terms of how static a novel is, and how fluid a board game can be in terms of making decisions and storytelling as the user, I thought of In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. I don't know if you've read that, but you might enjoy it. It's a memoir that jumps around as you read, so she gives you different instructions of where to go, and it's kind of like a choose your own adventure in the style that she's written it. It's not a choose your own adventure book, but it's a really creative and playful way of telling a story, which is unusual in the novel, in terms of novels. And in terms of games, I think that's really interesting, and that's a plus, I think, in game industry, that you can set up as much of the story as you want to, and then direct the players to go on from there. Like, personally, I like quite a light touch on the storytelling, so there's plenty of room for players to make their own stories and to really revel in the world that you've created. But I know that there are other gamers who really enjoy directed role-playing games and or story-directed games, which I think have, they're equally exciting. But I think the industries are interested in terms of what a novel is capable of and what a game is capable of, in terms of inviting the player to also make the story with the designer.
Do you also see parallels between the two industries now that you are, both working in the book industry and working actively in the game industry?
There's definitely parallels. I think as a marketer there are parallels, because it's a similar type of, you're marketing a physical product, and there are similarities there. From my experience so far of working in the game industry, it seems to be a less mature in terms of the age of the industry version of the book publishing industry. And the things that I noticed there are smaller publishers, which in a way is brilliant because the barrier to entry is so much lower. Indie publishers can launch with a fairly small amount of capital and make games with crowdfunding support, and that's a totally acceptable way and an exciting way to make a game. Whereas in book publishing, not so much. Like, that's obviously possible, but there are established routes to communities and markets. I think that there's also, like, I was reading a couple of days ago about a conversation about how board games should be previewed and reviewed. And in the book industry, you send a preview copy out. If it gets reviewed, then great. If it doesn't, that's just what happens. But the board game industry seems to be working a few of those things out and establishing industry norms. And I think it's an exciting time to be working in board games because it's growing at a rate, but there's also a lot to learn, I think, for the industry as it goes along.
Yeah, I definitely experience that as a reviewer because there's always conversations about, oh, at what point are you biased? And, there's some people who consider a review copy to be compensation, whereas in book world, hardly. That's you don't expect a good review from the New York Times because you sent them your book. But of course, that's also because there are media outlets to work for, whereas in board games, we're all doing it on our own. Whereas a booktube, though, also is there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one in terms of media because of the influence booktubers and people on social media have versus traditional printed media. And I think it's something that all industries are learning at the moment. So recently, as I'm sure lots of people who work in reviewing will know, that you have to mark a product with, ad or gifted or, PR sample, whatever it is. And that's a learning curve for the book industry as well, because if you're working with someone who is running their own channel, that still has to be navigated. And it's just, yeah, I think that's part of the age that we're living in as well. That's something to navigate.
Yes, that cross current is actually, yeah, that is sort of an interesting thing, isn't it? Like the book industry is also changing in terms of how review ethics have to be talked about after years of kind of standard practice.
Absolutely, yeah.
So as a marketer, you talk about bringing people in both as readers and as gamers. Are the strategies for that similar, or do you have to take a different approach depending on book or game?
I think there has to be a slightly different approach just based on what the product is. So for a game, to allow people to preview parts of that game, they need a certain level of accessibility. They need to have requirements like a computer or the ability to buy the game, which is more expensive than a novel normally. With a book, it's slightly easier because you can do things like extracts and digital versions of the book where it's like 99p, so a lot more affordable in terms of price point. So there are those considerations, I think, to look at. But I think when it comes to games, I think the audience potential is vaster because there are people that have games can be made of any type of interest, and reaching those groups, I think, is an exciting thing. Whereas if I wrote a book about dogs, people, that's going to reach a very specific type of person, maybe not all, several dog lovers, but games about dogs where there's more potential within the contents of the product, I think that offers a slightly different opportunity for marketing.
So your academic work is also about women and subversion and kind of recognizing, women's issues. How does that also play over into your game life, or does it? Like, did you pick the theme that you picked? Partially out of personal interest, right? But are you trying to make sure that what you create is appealing to women? Is that part of your marketing as well? And how do you play that?
Yeah. In terms of Dog Park, I've designed a game that I want to buy, and as a woman, that I suppose answers some of that question. I think it's incredibly important to think about, and this is more as a publisher, is this game saying, I want to be played by every person who wants to play it? Or am I saying in my rule book, am I using the pronouns he? Have I only included meeples that look like men? That is incredibly important to me as a publisher. And I think there's a lot more scope for making games that look like they are inviting the broadest possible audience possible.
So I actually do want to talk more about this because I feel like this is also an area where, the book industry has had a lot of conversations that are still ongoing for good reason about things like diversity, inclusion, recognizing own voices, literature. But I feel like the board game industry, we're still kind of having fights about how to appeal to a broad audience. And, there's a large component of people who will say, well, if the game is fun, people will play it. There's no need to worry. I just play what looks good. From a marketing perspective, is that actually true? Or do people really need to see themselves in games in order to feel invited?
I think that if I think the current output of the games industry is designed by people who play games, and the majority of those are men, and the majority of those are white. And that's not a criticism. That's just how that is. And you design, I think you gravitate towards the stories you know. Like owned voices are not only important for not appropriating other people's stories, but in terms of they're often the easiest thing to design. You design what you love. You design what you know. I think from a marketing perspective, you're going back to the same pool of people if you're designing the same type of game. And that pool, I'm sure, is huge and lucrative, and lots of publishers will benefit off that. But there are other people to make games for and other people to include, and there is a business angle to that, but there's also a humanitarian and a social angle that everyone who wants to play a game should feel like they're not being excluded. And that comes down to the terminology that we use as gamers and designers as well. Like, should we be saying things like dudes on a map, for example? Not really, because it's not, that immediately puts up a linguistic barrier that's saying, if you want to play this, you need to feel comfortable stepping into the shoes of a man. And I just don't think we have to make those constraints. Like, if you want to play those games, great, good for you. There are some brilliant games that are made in that style, but I think there's scope for more. Well, there is scope for more, and that's exciting.
Yeah, it is. And I also think about this as a reader. I don't know about you, but did you read a lot of books that were by women in school that were presented to you as classics? Because I sort of feel like I grew up just assuming that I would just be expected to take on sort of the perspective of men. And I never saw it as problematic. I just saw it as something that I did. But now I actually read a lot of literature by women and wonder why that was not presented to me earlier.
Yeah.
Is that something that you think may be changing, at least in terms of the book industry? And does that cross over to games as well?
I can't speak in terms of syllabus for what children are reading currently. I know that I didn't read a lot of female authors when I was studying at school. I did more at university, but still not that many, and still not particularly diversely. So if the diversity can't end at it just being white female authors and that be taken as the win, I think that the book industry is getting better at publishing more diversely, but I still think there's an issue with pigeonholing. So I think there are lots of publishing houses and imprints that will have, say, well, we've got this black memoir for this autumn. We don't need another, person of colour, a memoir from a person of colour, because that somehow ticked that off the list. And that is just unacceptable because we don't look at white stories in that way. And I think with board games, I think it's slightly different in terms of the marketing, because when you buy a book, quite a lot of it is about the author, and the acquisition phase of that book as well is also about the author. That doesn't seem to be so much the case in the board game industry at the moment, but I think that's because, as we were talking about earlier, the barrier to entry is still quite low for indie publishers, for designers. But it goes without saying that the diversity within that pool is still, fairly undiverse. But I hope to see that changing, and I see a lot of really positive conversations about more conscious commissioning and designing, and I think that will continue to change. Sorry, John's got something to say about that.
A welcome guest. Oh. Yeah, I guess the question of women specifically is on my mind, just because, who wrote that article? There's an article out recently about how women will consume pretty evenly books that are written by women, books that are written by men. But men are statistically less likely to pick up books by female authors. And I would absolutely project beyond that if you continued the study, we would see the same problems regarding, white people reading stories by people of color, maybe straight people reading queer literature. I think that maybe marginalized people are expected to accept just whatever stories on offer, whereas people who do not feel marginalized see themselves everywhere and just stick with it.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, do you, as a female designer entering the game space, like, is that something that you think is happening in games as well? Do people not pay attention to game designers the same way? I always wonder.
It hasn't been my personal experience so far that I've had without Dog Park reaching Kickstarter yet, but it hasn't been my experience that there's been like, you're a woman. um, but I think that looking for peers, it's hard to find lots of female designers who are that is hard to find those. And I think it'll be interesting as I go on. I'm really hopeful so far. The community that they're curating, the people that seem to be interested in Dog Park are interested in it. I don't think they're particularly interested in me, but they're interested in the game, which is great. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in making good games for people, and in addition to that, being visible for other people working in the industry to say that there's another person in here who's not a white guy.
So, from a marketing perspective, the book industry is having its own issues, but seems more evolved. The game industry is young and evolving. How, other than changing language, can you be more inviting to a broader audience?
I think the content of games is like an incredibly obvious place to start. Don't appropriate stories that aren't yours and be insensitive. Don't promote narratives that promote slavery or colonization of other groups. Sorry, that sounds a bit like manifesto-y. But I think part of that is starting with the designers and publishers and being aware of the cultural conversation and also the consumer desire. I think the wider consumer desire at the moment is to respect those things and to respect other people and be welcoming. I don't think it's an insular kind of desire at the moment. And then I think also as a publisher as well, thinking about things like where are the games placed, like how normal is it for someone who doesn't buy board games to back something on Kickstarter? Is that a journey that they'd ever make, that they'd want to make? How familiar is that? Like trying to get the price point to be as accessible as possible. If that's not possible, trying to make versions of the game, whether that's print and play or online versions, that are available for people to access without thinking, I have to shell out whatever it is, £40, $60 to be part of the experience, because that's another thing that publishers will have to think about in terms of also other types of diversity and inclusion, in terms of how many people can be included in terms of a monetary standpoint.
Those are all really good considerations. Actually, I think especially in comparison with books, like I know about how much a book is supposed to cost. There's a roughly standard price range for hardbacks. There is a roughly standard price range for ebooks. I'm actually not seeing a very standard price point set in board games anymore. Is that something that you have struggled with? And like, what is your research as somebody who's about to price their own game tell you right now?
Yeah. I think it's because the content of board games is wildly variable to a book. So in book publishing, you kind of got paperback, hardback, and then larger formats. With board games, you could have a card game, you could have a vast minis bonanza. And pricing for us has been a really interesting journey. A lot of that's looking at competitors, looking at what people seem to be benchmarking their own games at, and then also working with manufacturers and finding out how much materials cost, and then working out, okay, how much do we need to run a business? How much do we need to, make another game after this? And so that's been a really fascinating journey, and eye-opening in terms of designing and publishing something. Other choices that I might have made differently if I were to do Dog Park again, having known about other factors going in.
So I also want to circle back to something really interesting that you said. And I think, again, like this is a conversation that is absolutely still happening in the book community, for example, around books like American Dirt.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in board games, it still feels like a really fresh discussion, which is, you mentioned not taking stories that aren't yours. And I feel like there's a lot of argument about, oh, how do you determine that? What about a historical topic? How do you, obviously Dog Park, that's very much your story. We saw the evidence in the background of this video. It was so cute. But when you think about storytelling and games or in novels or short stories or flash fiction, what considerations go into deciding whether you are qualified to tell a story?
It's a fascinating question, and something I think about a lot in writing, and the right to write, what topics are appropriate to write about. And when I approach that, or I approach game design, my thought is there a better person to tell the story than me? And if the answer is yes, and the reason they're a better person is because they'll have lived experience of that, and that lived experience relates specifically to being a marginalised group, then I think this is how I feel. I know there'll be people who disagree with me, and it's an interesting discussion. But how I feel is then that there's another story for me to tell. I have plenty of options. If I'm good at my job, then I should be able to come up with ideas that I am confident that I own and I'm not exploiting. And I just think that is an important consideration when thinking about making things to give to other people.
What about the scope for games to confront really difficult issues? And unless Dog Park takes a really dark turn, I don't think that's what's happening with your current upcoming game, right? But, I'm also somebody who, spends a lot of time looking at historical games and thinking about how games can express sort of more difficult cultural problems of war, problems of conflict. And, how do you think that, those topics can be best handled in game form? I feel like literature can really push a lot of boundaries and do a lot of things. In games, especially because the participatory nature of it, do you feel differently about the scope of narrative in games when difficult topics are on the table?
That's a really interesting question. I think that you're totally right about how much it changes when there is a participant rather than just a passive reader. I think games definitely have the ability to explore difficult topics, historical and otherwise. I think there is a question of what the appetite for that is. I think that's a really interesting question of how many people would like to buy educational kind of self-improving games. I think that's fascinating. I would love someone to do research on that. But I think it's definitely possible to tackle those subjects with the appropriate team. I think it's about building a team and being conscious from the outset that this is something that we know that we want to address, and to address this responsibly, how do we do that? And I think that's possible to build the team around that kind of question.
Do you think that your work on games is eventually going to make it over into your academic work as well as your creative work?
I'm really interested about researching and teaching, because my academic work has a component of teaching different types of storytelling and storytelling across formats. And a large part of my thesis at the moment is looking at how books are presented, and I'm also interested in how games are presented and how they're marketed to people. So I can definitely see there being crossover. My disposition for design and storytelling in terms of novel writing is quite different, as you like subversive femininity and dogs. They're not super close together. But I am interested then in how, the different types of storyteller one person holds, what's possible in terms of output. So this isn't really answering your question, but yes, I'm interested in how they go together.
All right, so let's push it then. Okay, so you're talking about presentation of books towards people. What are some insights that you've gained and that you teach on that particular topic for those of us who've never thought about it before?
Yeah. So part of the insight from research is recurring language in terms of how books are presented or how they're reviewed in traditional press, and the buzzwords that seem to reoccur. What is it about a I've got a blurb right in front of me here, and this one has a load of them in. What is it about musical prose and dazzling, failures, power, revenge, renewal? Like, these words there are certain buzzwords that seem to come up in different kind of eras of storytelling, and that's a marketing decision. That's flagging to say, if you liked Supper Club, like I was talking about earlier, you're also going to like whatever it is. What have I got on my shelf? Insatiable. I'm just looking at the stack of books in front of me. And so that's a really interesting consideration to think about as a marketer, if that were your profession, but also to think about as a writer. If you're approaching an agent, what language do you use to let them know that you are aware of how this book would be situated? Because at the end of the day, they have to sell this to a publisher who has to sell this to someone who's going to sell the book. And so that's an interesting consideration to think about, and something that's useful to be aware of whatever part of the industry you work in. And then from a teaching perspective, looking at how authors, particularly in my case, can use food as a tool. How many things can be explored using a breakfast scene? How can character be built? How can relationships be unpicked? How can tension be ratcheted up and plot forecasted? It's interesting to peel back with one type of tool in your box, how many things you can impact as a writer.
So now it's got me thinking about, okay, I think being really part of a community inhibits your ability to take a step back and see what your linguistic commonalities are. So now I'm like kind of thinking, okay, what linguistic commonalities do we have in board games? We have elegant, we have fiddly, there's
crunchy. I feel like it's a recent one. Crunchy comes up a lot.
Crunchy, yes, we like our crunch.
Which, like, if you're an outsider, like, what does that mean? Like,
right, whereas if you tell me a game is crunchy, I know exactly what you're talking about. But I can't actually define that for another person necessarily.
Yeah, just like kind of like this. Like, I need to do a hand movement.
So that's also really interesting in terms of marketing, right? I think about like all the Kickstarter blurbs I've read this very week, right? And they all talk about mechanisms. They talk about components, because we're very materialistic in our board game hobby. We really like to know about our components and their quality. Yeah. But then beyond that, like, what kind of flavor words are we using? I mean, that actually is a really interesting consideration. And, you're right about crunchy. Like, how inviting are our flavor words to people who are not initiated into the world of board games? And then how do we change that? What kind of changes should we make?
Yeah, I think it's an awareness of publishers and their marketers of, if you're trying to reach a new audience, you need to ideally immerse yourself wherever they are congregating and immerse yourself in their world, and then work out how to talk to them. And that has to be kept. I think it's so easy as someone who's writing Kickstarter copy right now to slip back into point to point and point to point movement and set collection. And if you're not a ball gamer, it's like, what is that? Like, and to think more about the storytelling, taking it back to its roots and taking out the jargon, because the gamers will know by looking at the game, and that detail can come later on. But in terms of like the thematic storytelling and trying to include more people, it's going back to what storytelling is, rather than relying on shorthand, which is a game community we all love and is really useful. But also does close a door if you're not part of that community.
Do you think that we're going to see an evolution in using that more, I guess, more confined language as the board game industry expands? Because I feel like right now it's also that we're kind of in an echo chamber, right? Where most publishers are also gamers. We're all very immersed in each other, in Board Game Geek, in our own little corner of Twitter. What opportunities are we missing by not breaking free of that more often?
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky one because there's also opportunities are gained as well by staying in those spaces, by strengthening and deepening relationships. You get to know that core group intimately well, and you get to make if that's what you're interested in, making games for the people that you surround yourself with, then you'll make brilliant games for them, I'm sure. And that might be, it might not be every publisher's intention to try and reach new audiences. And I think that's fine. I think that if you do something well and you enjoy doing it and the people that you're making things for enjoy playing it, then good for you and all power to you. I think as the industry grows, there will be a more conscious effort to reach a more mainstream audience. And that's partly a business decision. There's more commercial potential there. And also it'll be, another type of business decision is that it might not be such a heavy component packed game like you were mentioning. Like, it probably won't be a huge minis game with a modular map to go on. It will be something smaller, cheaper, and more digestible for a consumer that may not have a huge board game library. But both approaches are okay, I think, as long as neither are shut down or dismissed.
Are there some adjustments to our language that we can make as gamers to make introductory games sound less like bad somehow? Does that make sense? I feel like a lot of us talk still about gateway games, or we describe lighter, quicker games as filler, and they do in fact fill time between larger games at game night. I mean that's not an inaccurate description depending on how you're using the game, right? But even talking about light versus heavy, there's a certain I'm more hardcore than you, like, vibe that comes from, like, yeah, I'm a heavy gamer. And, like, I say that I am a heavy gamer. I'm making fun of myself, I'm not here for those family weight games. No, I actually totally am. But so, like, are there ways that we can change our terminology to make it sound less condescending and more welcoming? Because something like Azul is a beautiful game design, and it's amazing. And there is no need to make it sound like it's not that by calling it, oh, it's accessible. I mean, like, it's good. Accessibility is good. But, we're implying there's this, like, labyrinth of people who are smarter than you playing harder games than you. And is there a way to adjust this?
I think the way you phrase that question is super interesting, because you're right. Accessible is the way to describe Azul. Like, there's not a better word to describe that. I think the issue that you're getting at is tone, and that those words may have been co-opted as bad words. And I think part of that is maybe comes from grassroots gaming and reclaiming those words and reclaiming the spaces of, this is an accessible game that I love to play with my friends who don't want to play Gloomhaven with me. And part of that, I think, maybe it doesn't, this might be naive, but maybe it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. It's is embracing all the various categories and the way we describe them. And coming back to your point about labeling something as filler or gateway, I think that's fair. For me, that's fairly acceptable language amongst gamers. But if you're trying then to describe something to someone who's not a gamer, that's when you have the problem, is because you're using language that is kind of foreign, and you may be putting up a barrier where it's like, I don't know what a gateway game is, and I'm not into it. So I think a lot of it is about tone and kind of individual impetus on what kind of, a lot we can take personal responsibility for that, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
So how do you balance, and this is actually always the question I land at, I'm very hardcore about people being allowed to do what they want, and I'm a progressive person. I'm very liberal, right?
Mm.
But I also do think it's important to respect other people's freedom to make their decisions and design what they're going to design and to publish what they're going to publish. However, I do think that just saying, well, you go on with your bad self, everything's great, we can accept everyone, is not, it's clearly not creating the community that gamers need if we're going to not only grow from a marketing standpoint, which that's its own thing, but also be welcoming
Mm.
and invite a more diverse group of gamers, including women, including people of color, including, people from the queer community. We're not, by just saying, oh, well, everyone can just do what they want and we're fine. We're not necessarily doing the things that we need to do
Mm-hmm.
to make our community inclusive in ways that are equitable and that are, I guess, making us the kind of community that I want us to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So how do you balance between, yeah, you make games for your people and it works great and go on with it, and wait, maybe we're creating spaces that aren't safe for other people and that aren't inviting in ways that have deeper social resonance than just I like this kind of game.
Yeah. Yeah, when I mentioned about if you make games for a particular type of person, go ahead and carry on doing that. I think if you do that, then if those games are fairly criticised, you have to take that. And I think if you are looking to, succeed as a publisher, then there's feedback to take on board in that instance. And I think part of it is for publishers to listen to that and also for gamers to give it, and not to be like, it's still quite a new industry, and feedback makes a difference and people power makes a difference in that regard. I think it's an interesting one in terms of diversifying teams as well. So if you have an all-male team, that's not something that I would be happy with. Like, I would want to have a team that has, women in, and I think that that's something else that we can think about as publishers and as gamers, that we can start expecting from publishers as well. Because it's reductive, but I do think there's a level of you can't be what you can't see, and the community can't be what it can't see. And obviously, there are plenty of brilliant women gamers in the community at the moment who are, enjoying the games that are made, but there could be more. And that's something that publishers, for sure, I think, have to be aware of.
So I think this is actually really interesting. It's bringing up this kind of relationship that I think we all have a hard time talking about in gaming, especially because, reviewers, including me, and publishers and designers, we all are friends at conventions. I have really strong ethical lines about where I'll take money and where I won't. Other people have different lines they've drawn for themselves. We're all negotiating it. But there's also this, I think it's really interesting to talk about sort of creating versus criticism. And the idea that just because you created something, that doesn't mean that that's now your sacrosanct baby that nobody gets to point at and say, this is messed up, or this needs to change. So how do people in book marketing respond to criticism? It's such a huge industry, and there are so many different places from which criticism could come, as well as a totally different hype machine. So let's start there. How do book publishers respond to criticism? How do they hear it, and to what extent do they pay attention?
I think they certainly pay attention. There is a kind of depressing element of, if there is a market for something, it will likely get published because there's money on the table, which is just a depressing element of living in a capitalist society. But saying that, there is also a real drive for prize lists, for example. If a prize list is all male or all white, now with the advent of social media and of being able to have meaningful opinions and express them quickly without barriers, that's starting to change, or at least be held accountable. And it's the holding to account that I think is starting to change things in the book industry. Like, there's a long way to go in terms of true reflective diversity and making stories and publishing stories and paying equally for stories by writers of all backgrounds. I think the same is possible for the board game industry, and it's partly it's tricky though, as you say, because it's a small industry and you're friends with publishers, and holding someone to account is a hard conversation. But I think that in a way those friendships will help, because those conversations can be had maybe in a more impactful way, because it's not someone that you don't know. It's hopefully someone that you can affect change with. And I think it's being brave as a player, and as a reviewer, and as anyone working in the industry, and speaking up for what you think is the right thing to do for you and for other people.
Yeah, that is an interesting point too, because I feel like if I had a problem with a book published by Penguin Random House, I would not expect to hear back from somebody at Penguin Random House. Just as an example, not personal at all. Okay. But if I have a problem with a game that's come out, odds are I can either talk to the designer or to someone who works for the publisher. Like, that direct access is still there. And I do think that, yes, that's hard, because it's a lot harder to look somebody dead in the eye and say, I think this is a problem. Because, it's always that personal element makes it harder. But I do also think that, it's easier in terms of access. This is the most open time I think the board game industry is ever going to have to be able to have blunt conversations about where we're going together.
Yeah.
Because if things become more corporate and more distant, like, I don't know who to talk to at Asmodee. I know who to talk to about a Kickstarter campaign.
Yeah.
But that it also requires a lot more personal fortitude. It's a lot easier to yell at someone you don't know.
It is. I think that yelling at someone you don't know you have to be heard. I think there has to be more than one person, which is possible, obviously, but I think there is potential for change in a smaller industry, and maybe that's how it is with all smaller industries as they grow. That change happens because it can happen by you sending an email or picking up the phone to someone that you know, and then positive change can be affected. But yeah, it's an interesting point about, in the book industry, if there's criticism, it's normally coming from several voices that have been raised up as one, rather than a quiet word with saying with a publisher, I don't think that was a sensitive thing to publish, or something like that.
Yeah, and of course all of this plays now into our current discourse about cancel culture, such as it is. And I think that's also interesting too, because, I think it's important to get your voice out there and to criticize, even if I think, people interpret that as intention to cancel, and that's not necessarily the case. Asking for change is not asking someone to go away forever necessarily. And working out sort of the rules, I think, of accountability, what it means to respond correctly when you're being held accountable. It just means something that's so much different when it's really individuals interacting with each other in public.
Yeah, there's a different tone there, because it's confronting. If you're confronted by an individual, it feels like something that is much more akin to your relationships and your normal life, and that can be scary. But equally, that's kind of, I think, where the most possibility for change is, because, like you say, if it's a large conglomerate, you get less chance to make contact when you have something to say. But it's a really interesting time, and I feel anyway, there's generally more of a conversation happening about accountability now, and respectful design, and just respectful participation in the community. So it's a really interesting time, and I think a hopeful time. It's my dog. Can you see him opening doors back there?
I can. So those of you who are on the pod, if you come watch the video around this time, this dog just opened a door.
It's a lethal habit.
Yeah, one of my cats can do it too, and it's like, oh, I thought I was going to Get to shower alone today.
Well, he just goes into that room to eat Lego, and then it's like, can you not eat the Lego?
So we've been talking about some heavy stuff, but on a lighter note, why don't you just take a second to plug your game? Tell us all about Dog Park and how cute it's going to be.
Okay, it's going to be very cute. I'm very excited about it. So Dog Park is a game for 1 to 4 players in which you take on the role as dog walkers with your friends. And over 4 rounds, you are collecting, caring for, and walking dogs through this beautiful dog park. And the game has been designed to include all 221 dog breeds that are recognised by the UK Kennel Club. So it's a real celebration of 4-legged friends. I hate myself for saying that.
It's the marketing in you.
I know, it really is. It's like, just don't do it. Don't do it. And it is a really, as the person that didn't do the art, I can shout about it as much as I want, but it is beautifully put together by an amazing creative team. That's art directed by Dan May, who also did the art direction and graphic design for Everdell and A War of Whispers. So an amazing talent. Brennan Noonan, who also did the development for Everdell. She helps to develop Dog Park, and working with her on storytelling in terms of board games has been just invaluable as we've worked on this project. And then our 2 artists, physical artists, are Holly Exley, who's a British-based watercolour artist who's done an amazing job at illustrating these 221 dogs, and Kate Avery, who's illustrated the park, which I want to just live in. I want to crawl into the painting and live in it. So yeah, it's really fun. It's a set collection game. I'm sorry if you're not a gamer and you're hearing me say set collection after everything that I've said, and you're like, please tell me what this is. And yeah, it's a really fun one that we've enjoyed developing. Definitely a game for dog lovers, and just, if you love a beautiful game.
Fantastic. All right, so what, other than your game, which is of course the primo game that you would be playing right now, what's a game that you're currently playing and enjoying?
Oh, good question. I'll tell you what I laughed about in a little bit. One that I'm playing and enjoying at the moment is, I played Viticulture again recently, which is really nice. I used to play Viticulture a lot a while ago, and I'd come out and my brain would feel like it had been wrung like a sponge. And I feel like I've finally got to the point with the game where I know it well enough where I'm like, it's fine, I'll just run my vineyard and it's fine, it can go smoothly, it'll go well. What else did I like? Parks, I always love by Keymaster Games. That's such a joyful game, and the art in that is just fantastic. And the thing that I was laughing about, because whenever someone asks me my favourite games, I just want to shout bananagrams because I'm obsessed with this game that comes in a banana. Yeah, I love that one. One that I like to play
no
with.
Shame.
No, absolutely not. And a great one for people that aren't familiar with other games. It's a really nice quick one. So yeah.
Oh yeah, I've stocked it for students before. I actually need to go and get new versions of some of those games. Yeah. And then since you are a reader, what is a really good book that you've read recently that the rest of us should consider?
Yeah, one that I've read very recently, which has really stayed with me, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since, is Transcendent Kingdom by Yargessi. Which I just loved. I find her writing so beautiful but incredibly economic with her prose. There is absolutely no bag in that book at all. It's just really gorgeous, and I don't think that there, in my experience of coming across them, there are enough books that look at the relationship between science and religion, and that the tussle of that, and the middle ground of what the experience of living a scientific and a religious life is like. Another one that I've loved recently, I may go on, so do shut me up if I'm carrying on too much, is Luster by Raven Lalani, which is a great book that came out, I think, last year now, which is a millennial woman's struggle to kind of find what she wants to do whilst grappling with kind of institutionalized racism, sexism, being a woman in the world in New York, which was a great read as well. I will stop talking now because I just have a stack of books and I'll just read them out to you.
No, I'm the exact same way. So he's like, what should I read? It's like, but I will absolutely second your recommendation of Transcendent Kingdom, and I'm going to check out Lesser myself now. But Transcendent Kingdom, by the way, for those of y'all who are listening, it is so good. Man, that book hit me hard.
Yeah.
I thought about it for a long time after I read it.
Stays with you, doesn't it? And it's like, oh my God.
It does. Yeah. Especially, it hit me really hard, especially because, I was raised Christian myself, not quite that hardcore. Also, I mean, she has, I won't ruin her own faith journey, but like I am a total heathen at this point. But, but reading about other people's religious struggles from the American South is like, is really interesting. And it's done so well in this particular novel. It's good stuff.
Yeah.
All right. So last, just sort of boilerplatey question. Where can we find you online?
You can find Birdwood Games, which I do a lot of my game tweeting at, obviously on Twitter. We're at Birdwood Games, and you can find us the same handle on Instagram. And on our website is just birdwoodgames.co.uk. Loads of information about Dog Park and signing up to our newsletter. And if you want to follow me, I talk less about games, although a little bit about games, and more about books. You can find me at LD Hazell on Twitter and Instagram.
Fantastic. And those of you who watch the pod, you can find me anywhere as Beyond Solitaire. Lottie, thank you so much for coming on. This was so interesting, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I could talk to you for hours. I'm like, we could just carry on.
So those of you who listened, thank you so much. Leave us a like, leave us a comment, and most of all, happy gaming and reading. This is a dual podcast.